I was guiding Zoe through a quiet grip exercise when the door slammed open. My father's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. Sharp, cold, certain. He didn't see a little girl learning to trust her body again. He saw me, his daughter, in scrubs without status, daring to heal without permission. My brother followed arms crossed, words loaded with contempt. They questioned my qualifications, threatened to shut everything down. But what happened next didn't come from me. It came from the child they dismissed and the man who stood beside her. And in that moment, everything began to shift. My name is Hannah Brooks, and I used to wear a uniform that meant something. Lieutenant Colonel, spinal trauma specialist, the kind of officer who didn't just patch wounds but pushed paralyzed bodies toward the impossible. But now I wear navy blue scrubs that don't even have my name stitched on the chest. Just a plastic badge that reads Nursing Support Temp. The first time I walked back through the glass doors of Crest Hill Medical, I held more than just an application in my hands. I carried years of deployments, field commendations, a doctoral degree in neuromotor rehabilitation, and stories from tents soaked in sweat dust and human willpower. I had come home not expecting a parade or red carpet, just a place to serve again. My father didn't say much when I showed up in his office. He sat behind the same mahogany desk he'd ruled from for decades, the kind of desk that looked like it belonged in a museum. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his white coat bore his name in elegant embroidery, Dr. David Brooks, Chief of Orthopedic Surgery. He glanced at my file, then back at me, his eyes hard to read. "I'll pass this along to HR." He said, his voice neutral, like he was dictating surgical notes, not speaking to his daughter. 2 weeks later, the offer letter arrived. Contract nurse, temporary non-physician role. Mo. Limited to observation and bedside support. No authority, no diagnostic access, no patient charts. My title erased with the stroke of a committee pen. I read the letter 3 times, thinking there must have been a mistake. But there wasn't. My father didn't mention it again. Neither did my brother Michael, who barely looked up from his laptop the next time we crossed paths. Dr. Michael Brooks, neurosurgeon, prodigy, head of neurological reconstruction. The kind of son my father introduced with pride at medical conferences. At dinner that weekend, the conversation flowed like it always had, sharp and surgical. "You see that T12 compression yesterday?" Michael asked Dad as they passed the mashed potatoes. "They're still using posterior instrumentation, but I swear we could stabilize better with inner-body fusion if they'd let us revise." Dad nodded, distracted but invested. Standardized protocols are killing innovation. I sipped my wine and stayed quiet. No one asked how my day was. No one mentioned Kandahar or the young Marine who stood unassisted for the first time in 6 months, because I built a balance drill out of scavenged bricks and rope. At one point, Michael turned to me more amused than curious. "How's the stretching gig?" he asked. "Still teaching leg lifts?" I smiled tightly. Still teaching brains how to listen to their limbs. He laughed short and dismissive, as if I'd cracked a joke I didn't realize was funny. That's how it always was in our house. We didn't talk about feelings. We talked about procedures, protocols, prestige. Even as kids, we didn't play with toys. We dissected plastic skeleton models. Dad once gave Michael a medical textbook for his 9th birthday. For mine, I got a lab coat 2 sizes too big and a reminder that real doctors operate. I used to believe I could win them over, that if I worked hard enough, earned enough degrees, saved enough lives, they'd finally see me. But I learned the truth in silence. In the way my father never attended my commissioning ceremony, in the way my brother sent a group text when I earned my doctorate congrats. Well done. As if I'd completed a weekend CPR course, not defended a 300-page dissertation on spinal reactivation in trauma patients. There's something strange about being invisible in your own family. It's not loud. It's not even cruel. It's just quiet. Like sitting at a dinner table where no one makes eye contact, but everyone talks around you. So I stopped explaining myself. Stopped trying to translate the value of what I did into words they'd respect. In their eyes, I wasn't a real doctor. I didn't slice bodies open. I didn't carry a pager. I didn't sign off on discharge orders. Instead, I carried trays to room 214, where a stroke patient blinked in rhythm to communicate yes and no. I adjusted pillows for a Vietnam veteran who hadn't stood since 1993. I checked vitals, I changed linens, I documented observations no one would ever read. But in between all that, I watched. I listened. I took notes. Not to report, but to remember. Because I knew something the rest of them forgot. Healing doesn't always happen under the scalpel. Sometimes it begins when someone says, "You're still in there. I see you." When I walked the halls of Crest Hill Medical, I didn't see status. I saw systems. I saw post-op patients without mobility plans. I saw interns mispositioning hips and no one correcting them. I saw chronic neglect masquerading as efficiency. And I saw patients losing hope, not because they couldn't heal, but because no one tried to help them believe. One evening, I passed by the surgical wing. I saw my father through the glass addressing a room full of residents. He stood tall, poised, powerful. He gestured with confidence. They nodded in awe. He'd taught thousands of young doctors. He'd reconstructed more knees than anyone on the East Coast. He was a legend in orthopedics. And yet I wondered if he'd ever looked a paraplegic in the eyes and said, "We're going to try." Even if no one else believes it's possible. My father knew how to cut. My brother knew how to diagnose. But I had learned something else. Something in the desert, something intense where there was no fancy machines, just pain and determination. I had learned how to stay, how to sit beside a patient when they couldn't move a toe and say, "You're not done." Still at home, I was the joke in combat boots. Physical therapy, my dad once said, that's glorified stretching with a license. I smiled back and said, "Only if you don't know what to look for." The house I grew up in was filled with medical awards and plaques, magazine covers, and framed degrees. But none of them ever bore my name. It didn't matter, not then, because I wasn't chasing plaques. I was chasing that moment, when someone who had given up on their body looked down and saw a toe twitch just once and realized they were still alive inside. And yet each night as I laid my badge on the dresser, I felt the weight of erasure, of being seen only in shadow. I wondered if I'd made a mistake, choosing rehab instead of surgery, choosing hope instead of hierarchy. But then I'd remember the soldier with the T6 fracture who gripped my hand the day he moved his fingers for the first time. He didn't say thank you. He just cried. That was enough. Because even in a house of scalpels and surgical fame, I had learned something sacred. Sometimes the greatest healing comes from believing in what no one else can see, and that I told myself would always be enough. Even if they never said my name, even if they never looked up, I still knew who I was, Hannah Brooks, the one who stayed, the one who believed, the one they never saw coming. Kandahar was not a place you remembered in color. Everything was beige or dust or blood. The tents flapped like exhausted lungs in the midday heat, and the generators hummed like they were trying to drown out the sounds no one wanted to acknowledge. Grunts of pain cries muffled by morphine, the low beeping of heart monitors working overtime. That's where I learned what medicine really meant. Not the sanitized version with air conditioning and laser scalpels, but the raw version, where healing had to happen without a sterile tray or a second chance. I was stationed at Forward Operating Base Condor, embedded with a mobile field surgical team supporting the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion. My specialty spinal trauma and neuromotor reactivation. My tools, my hands, gauze instinct, and a will that didn't quit. Most days that was enough. Some days it wasn't. The week everything changed started with a convoy ambush. 9 soldiers came in, 5 with spinal injuries, 3 already paralyzed, and one they couldn't classify. He arrived unconscious. His body twisted at an angle that looked impossible. His face, what remained of it, was wrapped in sterile gauze. His uniform had been cut away. Dog tags, missing helmet, destroyed blood type scrawled across his chest in black Sharpie O-. No name, no unit patch, no voice, He became patient 009. The others called him Ghost. I called him mine. From the first night I made him my mission, not because he was special, but because no one else would. When you can't talk, can't blink, can't move, you become invisible in a place where survival depends on how loud you are. But I knew better. I'd seen healing begin in silence before. Each morning I rotated his limbs, adjusted his posture, ran passive motion drills on his shoulders and hips. I monitored vitals every hour, watching for the smallest flicker of response. An eyelid twitch, a change in skin tone, a muscle tightening under touch. Nothing. But I kept going. I talked to him while I worked, not because I expected an answer, but because I believed the body remembers sound even when the brain forgets. I told him what I was doing. I told him what day it was. I read from a field manual once, then switched to poetry when the words felt too dry. I hummed Mozart, quietly off-key, just under my breath, because I remembered a paper I read once about music activating memory in patients with dementia. On day 11 I saw it. A tremor in his left quadriceps. Tiny. Brief. But it was there. I dropped everything, crouched beside him, and whispered, "I saw that. I know you're in there." Still no reply. But I could feel something had shifted, not in his body but in mine. I believed again. On day 15, his heart rate stabilized in the middle of a power outage. The rest of the team was busy triaging another wave of casualties. I sat with him in the dark, holding his wrist, feeling the pulse with my thumb. It was steady. Strong. On day 17, I adjusted his right arm and watched his fingers curl. Not all the way, not fully, but enough to make me catch my breath. That night, I wrote in my field journal, Patient 009, T6 fracture, unresponsive for 16 days. Today, he moved, barely. But enough. I didn't write it for a report. I wrote it for myself. To remind myself that hope isn't loud. It's a whisper, a flicker, a twitch. By the third week, I stopped waiting for others to join me. He was mine. Every hour I wasn't needed in trauma, I was by his cot. I adjusted his saline, massaged his feet, whispered commands like they were sacred. 2 fingers, just 2. Move them for me. Come back. 1 twitch at a time. I started humming again. Bach this time, then switched to a lullaby my mother used to sing when I couldn't sleep as a kid. My voice cracked halfway through, but I kept going. It wasn't for me. It was for the man who had no name but still had a pulse. No one asked about him. The files stayed blank. No next of kin, no updates. Just me and a shadow of a soldier who refused to die. Then the call came. My mother had suffered a massive stroke. Stateside. ICU. Critical. I was granted emergency leave and transport on the next outgoing medevac. I packed my duffel in 12 minutes flat, stuffed with sand-streaked scrubs and my field notes. But before I boarded the flight, I went to say goodbye. He was lying the same way I left him, hooked to machines, still silent. But there was something different in the room, a kind of weight like the air had thickened. I walked over, leaned down, and placed my hand on his shoulder. His skin was warm, dry. "Listen," I said, my voice barely audible over the heart monitor. "If you ever get out of this bed, don't waste it. Don't forget." I hesitated, then reached for his foot. "If you can curl your toes without looking," I whispered, "your spine is still listening." I didn't wait for a response. I couldn't. I turned and walked out before my chest cracked open. I boarded the plane, watched the desert shrink beneath the clouds, and told myself I'd done all I could. But the truth was, I wasn't ready to let go. Not of him. Not of what he represented. He was the patient no one believed in, the file with no name, the flicker of humanity buried under blood and trauma, and he was mine. For years after, I'd think about him at random moments, in the grocery store, while folding laundry, while walking down the hospital corridor back in the States. I'd wonder if he ever woke up, if anyone ever gave him a name, if he remembered anything at all. But I never looked him up. I didn't know where to start. There were no records, no ID, and maybe I didn't want to know. Because if he never walked again, maybe I'd failed. And if he did, but never remembered me, maybe I'd disappeared. Not just from his story, but from mine. Still, whenever I felt the ache of invisibility, back home at Crest Hill, walking hallways where my own family didn't see me, I thought of him, of the way his fingers had curled once, of the breath he took deeper after I hummed, and of that one line I left behind like a breadcrumb in the dark. If you can curl your toes without looking, your spine is still listening. I didn't know it then, but those words would come back to me. Not as a memory, but as a signal. A quiet knock from the past that would echo across years, across war zones, across hospital wards, all the way into the life of a little girl in a wheelchair, and a father who stood too still for a man at peace. But that was still to come. Back then I just closed my eyes on the flight and whispered one last thing to the sand below me. Don't forget I tried. The intake form was unusually thorough. Pages stapled together in a slightly crooked stack, each line filled out in precise block handwriting. Most parents in distress barely managed to scribble the basics. But this one was different. It was the kind of paperwork that felt military. Disciplined, methodical, complete. That was my first clue. Patient name, Zoe Cole, age 8. Diagnosis, paraplegia. Secondary to spinal cord trauma, injury sustained in motor vehicle collision, 11 months post-incident, referral neurosurgery, requesting secondary consultation for neuromuscular evaluation. I flipped to the last page. Emergency contact Grayson Cole. Relationship father. There was nothing dramatic about the name, no accompanying note or explanation, but something about the penmanship. The spacing, even the absence of flourish, told me this was a man who followed orders to the letter and expected precision in return. They arrived 5 minutes early. I heard the soft whir of wheelchair wheels before I saw them. Zoe was small for her age, her frame almost swallowed by the chair. She wore a gray hoodie 2 sizes too big, the sleeves rolled and pinned at the elbows. Her legs were covered by a light fleece blanket despite the warm air. Her eyes, dark, quiet, observant, flicked around the room but never landed on me for more than a second. Grayson Cole stood behind her, hands resting on the chair's handles, posture like a statue. Not stiff, controlled. The way soldiers stood when they'd spent years learning to command their body language, even in grief. His clothes were plain dark jeans, a worn flannel clean sneakers. Everything about him suggested discipline that had softened only slightly over time. He didn't fidget. He didn't look around. He simply waited. I stepped forward, clipboard in hand. Mr. Cole, Zoe. I'm Dr. Brooks. You can call me Hannah if you like. I crouched down to Zoe's level. Hi, Zoe. I'm here to help figure out what your body can still do. Okay. She looked at me briefly, said nothing, then looked at her hands. Grayson gave a small nod. She doesn't talk much. That's all right, I said softly. Sometimes silence says more than words. He didn't smile, but something in his shoulders eased by a fraction. I gestured toward the therapy room. We'll start slow. Inside, the lights were warm and the air smelled faintly of eucalyptus oil. Not because I believed in essential oils, but because hospitals often forgot how much scent mattered in trauma recovery. Everything was always antiseptic and metallic. I wanted this room to feel like possibility. I guided Zoe to the exam mat. She didn't resist as I lifted her, carefully adjusting her legs. Grayson stayed by the wall, arms crossed, saying nothing. Her legs were thin, almost bird-like, the muscles atrophied from disuse. I checked reflexes. Nothing. Tested her tone. Passive. No spasticity yet. That was good. We still had a window. Narrow, but there. Zoe didn't flinch. She didn't cry. But she didn't watch me either. She stared past me at the wall, her face unreadable. At one point, as I adjusted her foot, her body gave a subtle jolt. Not from pain, but vulnerability. That involuntary withdrawal that happens when the body remembers fear before the mind names it. I paused. Kept my hands still. "You're safe," I said quietly. "I promise. Nothing here is going to hurt." Her lips pressed tighter together, but she didn't pull away. I looked up at Grayson. She's physically stable. No contractures. That's promising. But we're running out of time to activate certain pathways. Neural plasticity decreases fast at her age. He nodded once. "So, what are you suggesting? I'd like to try functional rehabilitation. Intensive, daily. We'll use mechanical reflex therapy to stimulate her spinal arcs. It's non-invasive, safe. And if there's any residual responsiveness, we might be able to coax it out." His brow furrowed slightly. "We've tried things before. 12 programs. None of them worked. I know," I said, "and I won't promise this will, but I don't deal in guarantees. I deal in possibilities." He looked at Zoe. Not me. Her fingers were pulling at a loose thread on the hem of her sleeve. There was something heavy in his gaze. Not skepticism exactly. More like the exhaustion of a man who dared to believe too many times. I added, "This isn't about false hope. It's about creating a new kind, one based on what's still there." He didn't answer, just stood a moment longer in silence. Then quietly he said, "We'll think about it." Most parents at that point would hand the wheelchair off to a nurse. Grayson didn't. He lifted Zoe back into the chair himself, gently, methodically, every movement precise. He adjusted the blanket over her legs, made sure her ponytail wasn't caught in the headrest. Then, without a word, he wheeled her out. Just before the door closed, Zoe looked back. For the briefest second, her eyes met mine again. There was no plea in them, no fear, just a faint lingering question. "Do you really believe there's more?" That night I didn't sleep. I reviewed her MRI scans 3 times, traced every shadow of vertebrae with my fingertip, looking for a miracle in the grayscale. There was something there. Maybe not medically dramatic, maybe not even visible on imaging, but I could feel it in the way her legs responded to heat, to movement, to the presence of attention. Her body hadn't given up. It had just been left behind. By the 3rd morning, I was in the therapy room early, wiping down the bars, checking the alignment of the resistance bands. At 8:02 I'm in. The door opened. Grayson and Zoe entered. He didn't give a speech, didn't ask questions. "We're ready to try," he said simply. I nodded, hiding the relief in my chest. "Good. Let's begin." I introduced Zoe to something I called the sensory wake-up protocol. It wasn't high-tech. It wasn't glamorous. But it worked. I started with heat. Soft rice packs warmed in the microwave placed over her lower legs to reintroduce weight and warmth. Her eyebrows lifted slightly at the sensation. "That's weird," she whispered. "That's your brain noticing your legs again," I said. Next came the tennis ball. Rolled gently under her arches, tapping, pressing. Her eyes began to follow my movements. Slowly, tentatively. Then I moved to cross-patterning gentle resistance at her knees, light taps on her hips. Her legs flopped like clay, but that was expected. "This isn't about strength yet," I explained. "It's about reminding your nervous system it still has a job." Zoe didn't speak again that session. But she didn't look away. Her shoulders softened by the 10th minute. Grayson stayed in the corner, arms folded, watching, present, not hovering, just there. That alone made him different from most parents I'd worked with. When the hour ended, I asked softly, "Would you like to come back tomorrow?" Zoe hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." She waved as they left. It was small, but after nearly a year of silence, that wave felt like the opening sentence of a new chapter. Grayson didn't speak, but before the door closed, he gave me a look that said more than words could believe. Quiet, hard-earned, but real. And that I knew was where everything begins. The first full therapy session with Zoe started just after 8:30 in the morning. The light in the room was soft and slanted, streaming through the wide windows in quiet ribbons. Outside the parking lot was still half empty, the hospital stirring slowly to life. But in here, it already felt like a different world. A small world. A contained world. A space where things could begin again. Zoe sat in the therapy chair, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her sweatshirt sleeves were rolled again this time, held with 2 clothespins I'd left on the tray. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask anything, but she let me adjust the chair angle and gently shift her legs into position. Grayson stood a few feet away near the wall, as still as always. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. He didn't take a seat. He didn't look at his phone. He simply watched. That in itself made him different. Most parents hovered, anxious, afraid, full of questions. Others sat far away, trying not to hope. But Grayson stayed exactly where he was. Not imposing, not detached, just present. "All right, Zoe," I said gently. "Today's about reintroducing your body to sensation. Nothing scary, nothing hard, just awareness." She gave a slight nod. It was enough. I began with warm packs. Small microwaved rice sacks I'd stitched myself years ago during residency. I pressed them against her calves one at a time, holding them for several seconds before switching sides. She blinked. "Too hot?" I asked. She shook her head. "Tell me what it feels like." A pause. Then a whisper. "Heavy." "Good. That means your brain is noticing weight again. We want that." Her eyes moved slowly to her own legs, as if looking at something far away. Next, I brought out textured cloths, soft velvet, then burlap, then silk. I gently stroked the soles of her feet, the tops, the sides. Zoe twitched once. Not a reflex, just a startle. "That's okay," I said softly. "Your nervous system is doing what it's supposed to. Reacting." "I don't feel much," she murmured. "You don't need to feel everything. Just something." Grayson shifted slightly, not with impatience, but a kind of alertness. A soldier's readiness. We moved on to joint compressions. Light resistance applied to her knees and ankles. I narrated each movement not for her body, but for her belief. "Your knees used to be really good at catching balance," I said. "We're just reminding them." I watched her face carefully. Still no smile. Still no obvious progress. But she didn't look away. That alone mattered. Some patients, especially children, detach early in rehab. They retreat into themselves, afraid of disappointment, of trying and failing. Zoe didn't. She stayed present. Her body didn't respond, but her spirit hadn't checked out, and that told me more than any reflex test ever could. After 30 minutes, I offered a break. She shook her head. "Keep going." It surprised me, though I didn't show it. I adjusted her posture and continued with gentle rotations at the hip joints, then moved to stretching her hamstrings with the resistance band. As I worked, I occasionally glanced at Grayson. He never interrupted, never offered advice, never corrected her posture or asked what was next. And for the first time in a long time, I realized how much space that gave me. To focus, to lead, to connect. It wasn't just the silence. It was the trust inside it. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark, I saw Zoe's jaw relax for the first time. Her shoulders, always slightly raised in guarded tension, dropped just a little. She didn't laugh, didn't sigh. But her whole frame settled into the moment. That's when I knew we were getting somewhere. Not in her spine, but in her sense of safety. "Can I ask you something?" I said quietly as I pressed the tennis ball under her foot. She nodded. "What do you miss most from before?" Zoe stared at the ceiling for a moment, then said, "Running downhill." I paused. "That's specific." "My hair would blow in my face," she said. "I'd close my eyes and let gravity pull me." It hit me in the chest, not because it was poetic, but because it was pure. Maybe one day, I said, "Not downhill, but something close." She didn't answer, but she didn't scoff either. After 55 minutes, we wrapped the session. I covered her legs again and helped her back into the chair. As I secured the footrests, she reached up suddenly and brushed a piece of hair from her face, then looked at me and asked, "Do we come back tomorrow?" I smiled. Absolutely. As Grayson wheeled her out, I noticed something almost imperceptible. A faint nod from him. Not one of approval or pride. Just acknowledgement. I stayed in the room after they left. Sat on the floor next to the therapy table, letting the silence fill the space like steam after effort. The first session hadn't given us any reflexes, no measurable gains, no headline progress. But that wasn't what mattered. Progress was never linear, especially not in recovery. It's not the twitch that defines success. It's the decision to show up again. That night, as I logged the session notes, I found myself writing more than usual. Not just metrics, but impressions. Zoe responds to tone. She listens more than she speaks. She notices pressure shifts even if she doesn't report them. She does not pretend. She does not resist. She is fully present. And Grayson... I considered how to phrase it. Grayson watches like someone who has waited too long for something to break, but still hopes it won't. That's the kind of energy you can't teach. It's the kind you inherit from loss. Over the next 3 days, we repeated the process. Heat, texture, compression, rotation, no breakthroughs, no miracles. But Zoe came back. Every day, and that told me we were in it together now. On the 4th day, as I helped her back into the chair, I reached for the strap and noticed she was already holding it waiting. Little things. The ones no one claps for. But I saw them, and she saw me seeing them. That's where the bond began. Not in the therapy itself, but in the space between effort and faith. By the end of the week, I'd stopped thinking of Zoe as a case. She was a collaborator. And Grayson. He hadn't said much more. But one afternoon, as I wheeled the rice packs back to the microwave and passed him in the hallway, he said 6 words I hadn't expected. "She doesn't trust easily." "She does now." I turned stunned for a moment. He was already walking away. But in that brief moment, something shifted in me too. This wasn't just a protocol. It was a promise. And I would keep it. One quiet, careful day at a time. It started like every other session. The room was warm, quiet, the blinds half drawn to soften the morning light. Zoe was gripping a small rubber ball in her left hand, concentrating as I applied steady pressure to her right forearm. This was day 6 of her therapy. Still no visible movement, no flicker of nerve response in her lower limbs, but her attention had grown sharper. Her gaze didn't drift anymore. She watched what I did. She breathed in rhythm. That for now was enough. Grayson sat on a nearby chair in his usual spot near the corner, a man-shaped silhouette of patience. He was flipping through a small file folder, something that looked vaguely official. VA papers, maybe, or insurance forms. He hadn't spoken since arriving, hadn't needed to. His presence was all the support Zoe ever looked for. I adjusted the resistance band on Zoe's wrist and offered her a quiet, "Doing good." "Keep holding that." Then the door slammed open. Loud. Sudden. Purposeful. Zoe flinched. I looked up, already knowing who it would be before I saw their faces. My father entered first. Dr. David Brooks, Chief of Orthopedic Surgery. White coat starched so sharply it seemed to slice the air. His expression was carved in disapproval. My brother Michael followed close behind, sleeves rolled up like he'd just stepped out of a procedure, although the hallway didn't smell like OR. "Hannah," my father snapped. "A word." "Now." I stood slowly. My body moved before my mind caught up, instinctively stepping between Zoe and them. "We're in session," I said, keeping my tone even. Michael laughed dry and bitter. "Session. You're not authorized to run sessions. You're not even a licensed provider here. Remember." Grayson stood, his hands lowering the file folder to his side, watching. His expression changed, slightly, sharpening. Zoe looked from me to them, her fingers still wrapped around the rubber ball. Her breathing had quickened, not from exertion, but confusion. My father stepped further into the room and looked directly at Grayson. Mr. Cole, you've been misled, he said with a practiced calm that always meant something worse was coming. This woman is not permitted to administer treatment. She is a contracted assistant. At best, she has no medical authority within this institution. If you allow her to continue, you are risking your daughter's long-term safety and possibly permanent damage. Grayson didn't blink, didn't speak. He just looked at me. I held that moment steady. I kept my voice low and measured. Mr. Cole, would you like me to step out so you can speak with them privately? Zoe's hand tightened around mine. No, Grayson said. Just that one word, but it filled the room. Michael rolled his eyes. You're making a mistake. Then my father's voice shifted into the register I knew too well. Cold, slow, sharp. You think wearing fatigues makes you someone, Hannah? You always took the easy way out. You chose rehab because you couldn't handle the OR. You weren't cut out to make real decisions. And this, he gestured to the therapy table. This isn't medicine, it's the It's theater. Zoe stared at him. And then, in the quiet that followed, she said something that silenced everyone. Then why does it feel better when she helps me? Her voice was steady, quiet, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. For a second, no one moved. My brother looked away. First, jaw tightening. My father's eyes narrowed, his lips tightening into something between disbelief and rage. Grayson took a single step forward. I'll be filing a formal complaint, he said, his voice calm but steeled. For harassment, for interference, for professional misconduct. He turned to me. Please continue. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. He turned coat, swaying slightly as he stormed out. Michael followed, tossing a final glare over his shoulder. The door slammed behind them. For several seconds, no one spoke. I looked down at Zoe. Her grip was still tight. Her face was pale, but her eyes didn't leave mine. I gave her hand a small squeeze. You okay? She nodded. We resumed the session. Not because the moment had passed, but because it mattered more now than ever. We finished with a light muscle stimulation round. Nothing fancy. Just a brush test along her feet and calves. As expected, no response, but she didn't shrink back like she had that first day. She didn't flinch when I reached for her ankles. Progress, even if the data didn't show it. By the time we finished, the room felt different. Charged somehow. Like something had cracked open, not just between her and me, but around us. A protective circle that someone had tried to breach. And failed. Zoe thanked me a whisper again, but steadier. Grayson helped her back into the chair, adjusting the blanket like always. He didn't speak until they were at the door. Then he turned and said, If anyone else comes through that door again, you tell me first. I nodded, throat tight. After they left, I sat down on the edge of the therapy table and exhaled slowly. I had always known this moment might come. The confrontation, the exposure, the inevitable challenge from the very people who'd always treated my work like a lesser form of care. But I hadn't expected Zoe to speak. I hadn't expected her to defend me. And I hadn't expected Grayson to stand as solidly as he did not like a client, but like an ally. Later that day, I received an email from HR. No subject line, no explanation. Just a one-line message. Please be advised there will be a review of recent patient interactions. Of course there would be. But for the first time since returning to Crest Hill, I wasn't afraid. Because the truth had finally spoken. Not from me, but from a child who had been silent for months, and from a man who knew exactly what it meant to follow orders. Until the moment came when you had to break them to protect what mattered. That moment had come, and none of us were backing down. It was a gray morning, the kind that made your breath visible and your knees ache a little more than usual. Rain tapped against the windows like it had nowhere else to go, quiet and steady, painting silver veins on the glass. Inside the therapy room, I moved slowly through the routine, guiding Zoe's legs into a neutral position. She was calm today, focused. Her hands rested gently over her stomach, her eyes turned toward the ceiling, not quite watching but not withdrawn either. I picked up a soft rubber ball and placed it in her left hand. "This one's just to distract you," I said with a little smile. She smirked faintly. "You're not good at lying." "Lucky for you, I'm not lying." She closed her eyes, trusting. I knelt by her feet, cradling her heel in my hand, her foot warm and limp in my palm. Then, almost without thinking, I said it. Softly. Not to provoke, not to test. Just as truth. "If you can curl your toes without looking," I whispered, "your spine is still listening." I had said it before, once, in another world. But the words came out like breath, like something buried rising to the surface without permission. And then I saw it. Not in Zoe, in Grayson. He had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room, flipping through what I thought was paperwork, a dull green folder in his lap. VA forms, insurance, maybe meal plans. I hadn't really noticed. But the moment I said it, he froze. His entire posture changed, slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had slowed around him. He looked up, his eyes locked onto mine. And for a second, just one, he wasn't in that therapy room anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere louder, hotter, bloodier, Kandahar. His grip on the folder tightened, his knuckles pale. He stood, not fast, not erratic, but with a kind of decisive awareness, the kind that made me feel the air in the room shift. He walked toward Zoe, gently. Without a word, he placed his hand on her head and kissed her temple. Then he turned to me. He didn't say a thing, just looked at me like he had never really seen me until this moment. And then, with a nod that carried more weight than a speech ever could, he walked out. I sat still, very still. I stared down at Zoe's foot, at my hand beneath her heel. My heart was beating too fast. Not out of fear, out of recognition, out of memory. I hadn't said those words in a decade. Not since the field hospital, when I leaned over the cot of a man with no face, no voice, no name, and whispered hope into his body like it might stick. Grayson had recognized that. He remembered. He hadn't been just a soldier. He had been the soldier, the one they called Ghost. I barely finished the session, still in a fog of realization. Zoe didn't notice. Or if she did, she said nothing. But something had shifted, something unspoken and vast. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the lights low, my field journal laid out on the kitchen table like a relic. The pages smelled faintly of dust and antiseptic. I found the entry, March 2013. No name, T6 fracture, no facial recognition, only partial dog tag recovered, treated daily with passive motion therapy. Reflexes unresponsive. Day 11, faint quadriceps, twitch. Day 17, eye movement in response to voice. Day 21, emergency transfer. Care reassigned. At the bottom, scrawled in my handwriting, one line. If he ever walks again, I hope he remembers the music. I stared at it for a long time. And I cried, not because I was sad, because it meant something had survived, not just him, but the memory. Somewhere across town, Grayson sat in his own kitchen. His apartment was spare military clean. A pot of black coffee sat untouched on the counter. In front of him was a different kind of journal, green canvas cover elastic band frayed with time. He opened it carefully like it might fall apart. Inside were field notes from a place that had nearly erased him. Coordinates, call signs, sketches, notations in blocky handwriting, and then halfway through a small entry dated around the same time. Dr. L. Female. Calm tone. Hands didn't shake. Treated all 9 of us. No rank insignia. Week 3, she disappeared. Everyone walked after week 6. Except me. I stood week 7. Then she was gone. He stared at the page as if willing it to come alive. He remembered the silence of the tent, the humming, the scent of gauze and sweat, the voice that said, "You're still in there. I see you." The hands that rotated his limbs like they mattered. The steadiness of her presence when nothing else felt real. He whispered aloud, "It was you." The words landed like revelation. The next morning before dawn had colored the sky. Grayson was on the phone. He called Sanchez first, youngest of the group stationed now in El Paso. "Do you remember her?" he asked. Sanchez didn't hesitate. "She changed my life." Next was Cooper. Then Divine. Then Hartley. 8 calls in total. 8 lives changed. They didn't know her name, but they remembered her hands, her voice, her words. "She never said who she was," one of them said. "She never asked for anything." Another replied, "She told me pain meant the nerves were listening." "I've said that to my daughter." One by one, they agreed. They would come. Grayson didn't explain what for. Not yet. He just said, "You'll understand when you see her." And they said yes. Every single one. Some were retired, some still active. One was off the grid in Oregon. Another lived on a quiet ranch in Idaho. It didn't matter. They'd find a way. Because when a man owes someone his legs, he shows up. Grayson never told me. He didn't come to my door with a grand revelation. He didn't write a letter or send a text. He just began setting something in motion, a ripple of memory moving through time gathering force. And I, still unaware, still walking hospital halls like a ghost in Scrubs, would have no idea what was about to return. Not vengeance, not fame, but recognition. From those who remembered. From those who walked again because someone once whispered hope into their broken bodies and never asked for applause. Because sometimes the past doesn't knock loudly. Sometimes it arrives in silence, with boots polished and shoulders straight, and a salute that says everything. It was early, just after sunrise, when Zoe asked if we could take therapy outside. The weather had shifted overnight, leaving the morning air crisp and light, the kind that fills your lungs in a way that makes you feel awake in places that have been dormant. The hospital's small rehab garden had a concrete loop and a stretch of handrails used mostly for walking drills in spring. It wasn't much, but to Zoe, it was everything. She didn't say much as I helped her out of the chair and adjusted the braces beneath her pants. The straps were snug, hidden under the cuffs of her black slacks. She had chosen her outfit herself, a white blouse with a red thread stitched into the collar. I asked her about it once. She shrugged and said I sewed it in. It's like a reminder. Courage is a muscle, right? I never forgot that line. Grayson stood a few feet away, wrapped in his gray wool coat, hands in his pockets. His usual silence wasn't distant today. It felt like reverence. He wasn't here to supervise or protect. He was here to witness. I knelt down in front of Zoe and checked her supports. Her fingers gripped the armrests of the wheelchair. Her breathing was calm, steady. We'd practiced for this for weeks, each day building on the one before, collecting quiet victories like coins in a jar no one else could see. "Just stand," I said gently. "That's all we're doing today. 1 second if you can." She nodded. Then she took a breath, then another. And slowly, inch by inch, she began to rise. Her arms shook with effort, her knees trembling like saplings in a strong wind. Her brow furrowed, her face flushed with focus. I could feel her body fighting gravity with every fiber. 5 seconds. She was up. Not perfectly. Not gracefully. But up. 10 seconds. Her eyes met mine, wide and burning with something I couldn't name. It wasn't pride, not yet. It was recognition. A silent knowing that this was real. And then I smiled. Not a polite professional smile. The kind I'd learned to wear like a mask. But a real one. The kind that tugged at old scars buried deep beneath my ribs. The kind that cracked open something I hadn't felt since Kandahar. Grayson stepped forward but didn't speak. He didn't clap. Didn't cheer. He just let her have the moment. She stood there trembling and alive, the wind brushing her hair back from her face. Her cheeks were wet. Not from tears, but from cold air meeting warm skin. Her eyes flicked toward her father. He nodded once and she smiled so faintly it might have gone unnoticed to anyone else, but not to me. Finally, her legs gave way, and she sat back down slowly, carefully, her breath shallow, her chest rising and falling like waves after a storm. Grayson knelt beside her. He placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered something only she could hear. She nodded. Then he turned to me. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need proof. He looked me in the eyes and said quietly, "She remembered. And so did I." The rest of the day moved in a blur. I wrote my notes by hand instead of typing them, not because it was more efficient, but because I needed to feel every stroke of the pen. There was something grounding about ink on paper, like tracing the reality of what had just happened. I didn't record the time she stood or measure the exact degree of knee flexion. None of it mattered. She had stood. That was the data. Later that evening, I stood alone in the therapy room after hours. The sun had gone down and the room glowed in the soft gold of overhead lights. I walked over to the window and looked out at the garden. I could still see the faint outline of her footprints where she had shifted her weight on the damp pavement. I didn't cry. Not this time. Because I wasn't sad. And I wasn't overwhelmed. I was something else entirely. Whole, for the first time since returning from the desert, since walking back into my father's hospital with a file full of credentials and being handed a badge that said, "Assistant," I felt no urge to defend myself. No ache to prove anything. No desire to fight for recognition in rooms that had already decided who I was, because I didn't need their permission anymore. That moment, those 10 seconds, had given me everything. Grayson didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. I saw it in the way he looked at Zoe, then at me, then back at her, like his entire world had shifted 1 inch closer to healed. And I realized something then. Some men go to war to defend their country. Others fight quieter battles at home, sitting beside their daughter every day for nearly a year, waiting for something, anything, to return. And when it did, he didn't celebrate with noise. He simply witnessed. And in witnessing, he honored the journey. The next day, Zoe came in early. Her hair was braided, her braces hidden under jeans this time. She said nothing as I prepared the equipment, but when I handed her the soft ball to hold, she squeezed it, once looked up and said, "Do we keep going?" I smiled. "Every day if you want." She nodded. "Then let's go." We spent that morning refining balance, working on breathing patterns, posture control. Her strength wasn't dramatic yet, but her presence was undeniable. She no longer asked if it was working. She just worked. Later that week, I was told the hospital's rehabilitation conference was 2 weeks away. Every year it was the same white coats presenting charts, case studies, innovations most patients would never see. I always watched from the back if I went at all. But this year would be different. Because this year I had a reason to stand too. Not on stage. Not for applause, but behind the curtain, beside a girl who reminded me that hope wasn't loud. It was steady, and real, and earned. Zoe had taken 10 seconds of a stand, but for me it had been 10 years of silence breaking. And now, without fanfare or title, without a single word of approval from the men who'd once defined my worth, I finally knew what I had become. Not a doctor in their eyes. Not a rebel in scrubs, not the daughter who disappointed, but something much simpler, much stronger. I had become someone who stays, someone who sees, someone who believes in standing even when the world says it's not possible, and now I had someone beside me who believed too. And she had a name, Zoe. The auditorium at Crest Hill Medical Center had never felt so full, but rows of white coats, dark suits, and clipped name badges shimmered under the soft overhead lights. It was the hospital's annual rehabilitation conference, the one day a year where innovation and recovery were dressed up for display. Every department head was present, every board member, even those who hadn't been seen in months managed to show up when the cameras did. But this year, something felt different. not because of who was presenting, but because of who wasn't on the program. Me. And yet behind the curtain, I stood quietly beside Zoe. She was wearing black slacks and a white blouse. Her braces were hidden beneath her pant legs. Her hair was tied back in a neat braid and tucked beneath her collar. I saw that same red thread she'd stitched weeks ago. Courage is a muscle. She didn't look nervous. She looked ready. I crouched beside her wheelchair and whispered, "Take your time. You only need to do what feels right." She nodded, fingers gripping the chair's side rails. Her breathing was steady, but I saw the tiny flutter under her chin, the same one I had seen on the very first day we met. A stagehand gave us the signal. And then they called her name, Zoe Cole, patient of therapeutic reflex reconnection, demonstration by patient. I didn't follow her. She wheeled herself out alone. The room quieted as she moved to the center of the stage. Her wheels stopped beside a slim silver cane that had been placed discreetly at her side, more symbolic than necessary. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she closed her eyes, took one deep breath, and pushed herself up. One leg steadied, then the other. Gasps were audible, soft and disbelieving. The kind of reaction that takes longer than applause because no one quite believes what they're seeing. She stood. 5 seconds. Then one foot moved, then the other. 5 steps, 10 steps. She stopped at center stage, perfectly balanced. No music, no narration, just stillness. Then the applause began. Slow at first, then growing like a wave. It rippled across the auditorium until the sound filled every corner of the room. But before it reached its peak, a shift in attention broke the rhythm. 8 men entered through the main aisle. They walked in formation, dressed in military uniforms, medals, polished shoulders squared. They moved quietly, deliberately, the way only those trained in unison can. A murmur spread across the room. Heads turned, phones were lowered, no announcement had been made, no names were given. They walked to the edge of the stage and turned, not toward Zoe, but toward me. I stood frozen behind the curtain, half in shadow. They raised their hands in perfect unison and saluted. The air in the room changed. It stopped being about applause. It became reverent, sacred. I couldn't breathe. Then one of them stepped forward, tall, silver at the temples, a face lined not just by age, but by memory. He spoke clearly, not loud, but with a voice trained to carry. "We walk because of her," he said, "and today so does she." The silence that followed was louder than the applause that had come before it. No one moved. No one spoke. In the third row I saw my father. His hands rested on the arms of his chair. His face was pale, drained of color. His lips were slightly parted, but no words came. His eyes didn't blink. They didn't need to. He knew. My brother sat beside him. Michael stared at the floor. His shoulders had curled inward as if trying to vanish into the seat. I stepped out from behind the curtain, not for applause, not to claim credit, but because truth had finally stood tall in front of those who had tried to bury it. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Because Zoe had walked. Because 8 men had saluted. Because sometimes the loudest voice in a room isn't a speech. It's what's left standing after all the noise is gone. The ceremony ended, not with fireworks, not with a speech from the board, but with silence and standing ovation. Some clapped, others didn't. A few sat still stunned. But everyone had seen it. No one could unsee it. Afterward, I slipped out the side door before the crowd spilled into the halls. I didn't need congratulations. I needed air. Outside, the sky was beginning to turn gold, the late afternoon light touching everything with a kind of grace. I sat on the stone bench near the garden path. For a while, I just let the stillness wrap around me. Grayson found me there. He didn't sit. He didn't say much. Just stood quietly, hands in his pockets, watching the light change. Then he said, "They saw it." "Yes," I replied. He nodded. "And they won't forget." "No," I said. "They won't." He turned to me then. "You didn't just give her a chance. You gave me one too." I looked at him, not as a patient's father, not as a veteran, but as a man who once laid broken in a cot while I hummed Mozart to fill the silence. "You gave it to yourself," I said. "I just reminded you where to start." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. A patch, weathered threadbare with a faint insignia that I recognized instantly. He placed it in my hand. "You earned it," he said. "Back then. We just didn't know your name." I held it tightly, not because it proved anything, but because it connected everything. Past to present. Field hospital to therapy room. Ghost to girl. That night, I didn't review data. I didn't write reports. I didn't even open my laptop. Instead, I sat in the dark with a cup of tea and a memory that no longer hurt. Not all wounds bleed. Some just wait quietly until the world is ready to see them. And today they had. The applause hadn't even finished echoing in the auditorium when the emails began. First there was one with the subject line "Discussion of Professional Boundaries." Then came another urgent internal review, unauthorized procedures. By the next morning, my name was on the docket for a formal disciplinary hearing. There were no congratulations from the board, no messages from the department heads, no invitations to discuss the results, just a neatly typed memo taped to my locker report to Conference Room B at 9 a.m. sharp. The hallway was quieter than usual that morning. People passed me like I was a stranger. A few nodded politely. Most didn't make eye contact. One nurse I'd worked beside for 3 years avoided me entirely. When I entered the conference room, they were already seated. 6 of them. My father was among them in his usual place, hands folded in front of him, lab coat immaculate. He didn't speak. He didn't even glance in my direction. The head of the board, a woman named Dr. Minton, cleared her throat. "Hannah," she said, "while we acknowledge the emotional impact of yesterday's presentation, we have serious concerns regarding the precedent it may have set." Another doctor jumped in. "You administered treatment to a minor without full institutional clearance. You applied a therapeutic method that has not been fully peer-reviewed under supervision that was unofficial at best. They didn't ask how Zoe was doing. They didn't mention her name. They didn't ask what it felt like to see her stand after 11 months in a chair. They asked about policy, about authorization forms, about protocol." I answered calmly. "I had the full informed consent of her father," I said. "Yes," one replied, "but not the consent of this institution." The word landed like a blade. Institution. As if healing had to pass through doors guarded by titles and signatures before it could be called real. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I'd done that before. I knew what it led to. Nothing. Instead, I simply said I did what no one else was willing to try. They said nothing in return. The meeting adjourned 20 minutes later with no clear verdict. I was told the board would be reviewing my credentials pending further notice. In the meantime, I was not to administer any therapy beyond observation. I nodded, took my file, and left the room without looking back. But outside the hospital walls, something else was happening. It started with a video. A parent visiting from another wing had filmed Zoe's presentation from the audience. Just a few minutes of footage, shaky and unfiltered. She'd uploaded it to a parenting forum with the caption, "She walked today," because someone believed she could. By lunchtime, the video had 50,000 views. By evening, over 300,000. And by the next morning, my inbox was overflowing, not with warnings or reprimands, but with gratitude. Hundreds of emails from parents, from veterans, from students, teachers, caregivers, physical therapists, and patients who had once been told there was nothing left to try. The subject lines read like small bursts of hope. "My son hasn't walked in 3 years. This gave me courage. I wish I'd had a Dr. Brooks when I was recovering." She gave me back my daughter. One email simply said I watched it 5 times. I cried every time. The hashtags began appearing everywhere. Let them walk again. She walked because someone stayed. Give the quiet healers space. They weren't written by influencers or journalists. They were written by people. People who'd waited beside beds, who'd whispered into silence, who'd been told to stop hoping. And now they were speaking back. Reporters started calling, medical podcasts requested interviews. Schools asked if I would come speak. A rehab center in Vermont offered to name a training module after my technique. I didn't answer any of them. Not yet. Because what mattered most wasn't what the world was saying. It was what my father still hadn't said. He hadn't spoken to me since the ceremony. Not once. Not when we crossed paths in the hallway. Not during the hearing. Not even in passing. But that changed 2 days later. The building was almost empty when it happened. Most of the staff had gone home. The lights in the main corridor had dimmed to evening mode. I was walking toward the staff wing thinking of nothing in particular when I heard his voice behind me. Hannah. He said it steady, quiet, not like a reprimand, not like a parent, just my name. I stopped and turned. He stood in the hallway in his lab coat holding a clipboard that for once had nothing in it. A prop. A shield. Something to hold. We looked at each other for a long moment. Why didn't you say anything, he asked. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't sarcastic. It was honest, like he truly wanted to know. I took a breath. Not out of nerves, but out of the strange tenderness of that moment. Because for once we were not a chief surgeon and an assistant. We were just a father and a daughter. Because I didn't need you to believe me, I said. I only needed others to walk again. He looked down, then back up at me, studying my face like it was a puzzle that suddenly didn't fit the diagram he'd memorized for years. You could have fought harder, he said finally. I did, I replied. Just not in rooms where I wasn't heard. He swallowed once. A subtle shift. Then quieter, I wasn't trying to keep you down. I nodded. I know. You were trying to protect the institution. The family name, the legacy. I paused. You just forgot to protect me. That landed, not hard, but true. He glanced away. Adjusted his shoulders like an invisible weight had shifted. His face, always so composed, looked different in that moment. Older. Not in age. In knowing. Then he said the one thing I had never expected to hear. I saw her walk. I nodded. I know it was real. It always was, I said. There was a flicker in his eyes then, a glimpse of the man who once let me hold a stethoscope when my hands were still too small, who told me I had a mind like a surgeon and hands that could heal. He didn't say he was proud. He didn't say he was sorry. But he said something else. You're still not on the official board of physicians. I smiled. Then I guess it's time they update the list. He let out a breath. Almost a laugh. Almost. Then he walked away. No clipboard to hide behind. No title to lean on. Just a man realizing his daughter had become something he hadn't seen coming. Not because she had shouted, not because she had demanded a seat at the table, but because she had helped someone stand. Quietly, patiently, without asking for anything in return. And in doing so, she had stood taller than any title ever could. It wasn't in a church or a grand hall. There were no floral arches, no tuxedos, no champagne towers. Instead, we chose the hospital's rehabilitation garden, the same place where Zoe first stood, where silence had once meant despair but now meant peace. The chairs were simple, arranged in curved rows beneath an arch of blooming jasmine. White ribbons danced lightly in the wind, tied gently to the backs of wooden seats. There were no ushers, no speeches, no procession, only the people who mattered. Zoe walked the aisle by herself. No brace, no cane, no guiding hand. She wore a pale blue dress, her hair pinned loosely with white flowers. Each step she took sent quiet waves of emotion through the guests. And at the end of the aisle, she didn't turn to look back. She didn't need to. She knew we were all watching, and she walked like she belonged in the moment. Grayson stood at the far end, his hands clasped calmly in front of him. His suit didn't quite fit, but it didn't matter. What he wore couldn't contain what he carried, years of grief, redemption, and quiet love, finally allowed to breathe. I didn't wear a wedding gown. I wore my white medical coat, not as defiance, but as remembrance. That coat had seen field tents and blood-soaked floors. It had held the weight of failure and the quiet warmth of triumph. It had been dismissed, ignored, and then, finally, respected. It was my armor, my vow. When I reached Grayson, we didn't exchange rehearsed vows. Our eyes had already said them over the course of days, months, years. Through shared glances in quiet rooms and the sound of footsteps that shouldn't have been possible. "I found you twice," he whispered. "And I saved you both times," I replied. The minister was brief. Just like we asked. A few words about love, perseverance, and the spaces where healing hides. Then we were pronounced husband and wife, not to fanfare, but to soft smiles and misty eyes. In the front row, the 8 veterans sat quietly. Their suits were mismatched, their shoes scuffed. Their posture still remembered the war. But today their eyes shimmered with something gentler than memory. Gratitude. Zoe sat beside one of them, her hand resting lightly over his. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The language between survivors doesn't always require words. My mother was there too. She had spoken little since my father's resignation, but today she smiled. Not just for me, but for the girl I once was, and the woman I had become without asking for anyone's approval. When the ceremony ended, there was no rice thrown, no line for cake, just a small table with tea bread and Zoe's favorite lemon tarts. People talked in low voices. They laughed. They sat in the garden long after the sun began to set. No one mentioned the hospital board. No one said the word credentials. They said my name, just Hannah. Not doctor, not nurse, not the woman who stirred controversy. Just Hannah. And in that moment I realized this was the only ceremony I ever needed. The rest of the world could keep their judgments. I had already walked through fire. Now I walked forward, with love, with peace, and a future that finally felt like mine. We opened the doors of the center 4 months later. There was no ribbon cutting, no press release, no dignitaries in suits, just a wooden sign hand-carved by one of the men who once couldn't hold a chisel. The L Center. We never said what the L stood for. Some assumed it meant legs, or life, or legacy. It wasn't any of those. It stood for something quieter, listening, learning, leaping, and sometimes just simply love. We didn't name it after me, or after Grayson, or after Kandahar. We didn't hang medals on the walls or line the halls with framed newspaper articles. There was no wall of fame, only wide hallways filled with light. Warm, natural light that poured through every window, touching every wheelchair, every pair of crutches, every set of balance bars, every hand that reached out to try again. It wasn't a hospital. It wasn't a clinic. It was a space for stories to restart. Grayson and I built it with the help of the 8 veterans who had once saluted me in silence. They came not as heroes, but as witnesses. Proof that belief could stand where science hesitated. We started with 5 patients. One had survived a car crash. Another had cerebral palsy. One had been turned away from 3 facilities. 2 were simply tired of being told to adjust. Here we didn't promise cures. We promised curiosity, commitment, compassion, without the need for applause. Each room had a name. Not numbers, not letters, but names like whisper, pulse, thread, ember. The walls were painted soft gray. The mats were thick. The equipment wasn't fancy. But it worked. We taught by listening, by remembering that pressure on the heel could awaken memory in the spine. That sound vibration could help locate buried reflexes. That warm rice sometimes did what cold steel never could. We didn't track recovery as numbers. We didn't post outcomes on a board. We tracked footsteps, some steady, some trembling, some just beginning, but all moving forward. I never wore my white coat inside the center, just jeans and a linen shirt. I didn't want to be looked up to. I wanted to kneel, to hold a patient's foot in my hand and whisper, "Try again." And when they did, I whispered the same line I'd once told a girl named Zoe. If you can curl your toes without looking, your spine is still listening. One afternoon, I saw her in the far corner of the training room. Zoe, now 13, wearing a soft blue t-shirt and a name badge that read assistant coach. Her hair was tied back loosely. She was kneeling beside a little girl named Sophia, helping her across a balance mat. Sophia had survived spinal tumor surgery. She hadn't taken a step since. But Zoe didn't rush her. She didn't instruct. She simply knelt beside her present. "One step is enough," she said gently. "You're not walking to impress anyone. You're walking to remember who you are." Sophia blinked, then nodded, and took her first step. I didn't interrupt. I stayed at the edge of the hallway, notebook in my lap, sunlight warming the stone beneath my feet. I didn't write anything. I just watched. Because that day something beautiful happened. Not a miracle, not a cure, but a passing of the torch, from one survivor to another, from belief to the next generation of believers. And I realized I wasn't invisible anymore. Not to Zoe, not to Sophia, not to the veterans who returned every year to volunteer, not to the parents who sat in our waiting room clutching hope like it might vanish, and definitely not to Grayson, who never once asked to see my credentials again. Some professions keep people alive, but some people, they help others walk again, sometimes through fire, sometimes through shadow, and sometimes simply by staying long enough for someone else to try. If this story moved you even just for a moment, pause and think. Have you ever felt unseen, underestimated, or told you weren't enough, and yet did you keep going? Sometimes the most powerful victories don't come with applause. They come in silence, in steady steps, in choosing to believe again. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of this journey resonated with you the most? Have you ever met someone who quietly changed your life? Share your story in the comments below. We read every word. And if stories like this remind you of the strength we all carry inside, please consider subscribing, liking, and turning on the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter in our growing library of healing hope and second chances. Thank you for walking this path with us. See you in the next story.